Chapter 4. The house on Egypt Street became frantic with activity as the Tulane family prepared for their voyage to England. Edward possessed a small trunk, and Abilene packed it for him, filling it with his finest suits and several of his best hats and 3 pairs of shoes, all so that he might cut a fine figure in London. Before she placed each outfit in the trunk, she displayed it to him. "Do you like this shirt with this suit?" she asked him. "Or would you like to wear your black derby? You look very handsome in it. We shall pack it." And then finally, on a bright Sunday morning in May, Edward and Abilene and Mr. and Mrs. Tulane were all on board a ship, standing at the railing. Pellegrina was at the dock. On her head she wore a floppy hat, strung around with flowers. She stared straight at Edward. Her dark eyes glowed. "Goodbye," Abilene shouted to her grandmother. "I love you." The ship pulled away from the dock. Pellegrina waved to Abilene. "Goodbye, lady," she called. "Goodbye." Edward felt something damp in his ears. Abilene's tears, he supposed. He wished that she would not hold him so tight. To be clutched so fiercely often resulted in wrinkled clothes. Finally, all the people on land, including Pellegrina, disappeared. Edward, for one, was relieved to see the last of her. As was to be expected, Edward Tulane exacted much attention on board the ship. "What a singular rabbit!" An elderly lady with 3 strings of pearls wrapped around her neck said. She bent down to look more closely at Edward. "Thank you," said Abilene. Several little girls on board gave Edward deep glances, full of longing. They asked Abilene if they might hold him. "No," said Abilene. "I'm afraid he's not that kind of rabbit who likes to be held by strangers." 2 young boys, brothers named Martin and Amos, took a particular interest in Edward. "What does he do?" Martin asked Abilene on their second day at sea. He pointed at Edward, who was sitting on a deck chair with his long ears stretched in front of him. "He doesn't do anything," said Abilene. "Does he wind up somewhere?" Amos asked. "No," said Abilene, "he does not wind up." "What's the point of him?" said Martin. "The point is that he is Edward," said Abilene. "That's not much of a point," said Amos. "It's not," agreed Martin. And then, after a long, thoughtful pause, he said, "I wouldn't let anybody dress me like that." "Me neither," said Amos. "Do his clothes come off?" asked Martin. "Of course they do," said Abilene. "He has many different outfits. And he has his own pajamas, too. They are made of silk." Edward, as usual, was disregarding the conversation. A breeze was blowing in off the sea, and the silk scarf wrapped around his neck billowed out behind him. On his head he wore a straw boater. The rabbit was thinking that he must look quite dashing. It came to a total surprise to him when he was grabbed off the deck chair, and first his scarf, and then his jacket, and then pants were ripped off his body. Edward saw his pocket watch hit the deck of the ship and roll merrily toward Abilene's feet. "Look at him," said Martin. "He's even got an underwear." He held Edward aloft so that Amos could see. "Take it off," shouted Amos. "No," screamed Abilene. Martin removed Edward's underwear. Edward was surely paying attention now. He was mortified. He was completely naked except for the hat on his head, and the other passengers on board the ship were looking at him, directing curious and embarrassing glances his way. "Give me him now," screamed Abilene. "He's mine." "No," said Amos to Martin. "Give him to me." He clapped his hands together and then held them open. "Toss him," he said. "Please," cried Abilene. "Don't throw him. He's made of china and he'll break." Martin threw Edward, and Edward sailed naked through the air. Only a moment ago, the rabbit had thought that being naked in front of a shipload of strangers was the worst thing that ever could happen to him. But he was wrong. It was much worse being tossed in the same naked state from the hands of one grubby, laughing boy to another. Amos caught Edward and held him up, displaying him triumphantly. "Throw him back," called Martin. Amos raised his arms, but just as he was getting ready to throw Edward, Abilene tackled him, shoving her head into his stomach and upsetting the boy's arm. So it was Edward that did not go flying back into the dirty hands of Martin. Instead, Edward Tulane went overboard. How does a China rabbit die? Can a China rabbit die? Can he drown? Is it my hat still on my head? These were the questions that Edward asked himself as he went sailing out over the blue sea. The sun was high in the sky, and from what seemed to be a very long, long away, Edward heard Abilene call his name. "Edward," she shouted, "come back." Come back? Of all the ridiculous things to shout, thought Edward. As he tumbled, ears over tail, through the air, he managed to catch one last glimpse of Abilene. She was standing on the deck of the ship, holding onto the railing with one hand. In the other hand was a lamp. No, wait, a ball of fire? No. Edward realized it was his gold pocket watch that Abilene had in her hand. She was holding it up high, and it was reflecting the light of the sun. My pocket watch, he thought. I need that. And then Abilene disappeared from view, and the rabbit hit the water with such tremendous force that his hat blew off his head. That answers that question, thought Edward, as he watched the hat dance away with the wind. And then he began to sink. He sank and sank and sank. He kept his eyes open the whole time, not because he was brave, but because he had no choice. His painted on eyes witnessed the blue water turning to green, then to blue again. They watched as it finally became as black as night. Edward went down and down. He said to himself, "If I'm going to drown, certainly I would have done so by now." Far above him, the ocean liner, with Abilene aboard it, sailed blithely on, and the China rabbit landed, finally on the ocean floor, face down. And there, with his head in the muck, he experienced his first genuine and true emotion. Edward Tulane was afraid.